What happens when the one who always understands finally stops making excuses? When the quiet heart that once forgave endlessly decides enough is enough, every false smile, every hidden intention, every carefully crafted mask shatters, and the truth stands naked before us. ChatGPT said, "There is a quiet threshold in the human spirit that is rarely noticed until it is crossed, and for the empath, that threshold is the point at which they can no longer keep extending forgiveness without limit. For so long, their nature compels them to understand, to see beyond the sharpness of words or the coldness of actions, to search for the wound beneath the wound. They lean in when others pull away, believing that if they can just hold the space for someone long enough, the darkness will soften, the heart will open, and a different story will begin. They absorb pain like rain on dry earth, hoping to transform it into something nourishing. Every apology is met with belief, every mistake with the benefit of the doubt, every betrayal with another chance. It is not naivety, as the world often assumes, but a deep-seated conviction that people can change if they are met with enough love and patience. Yet this very faith becomes the slow erosion of the empath's own strength. With each cycle of harm and forgiveness, a small fracture forms in the trust they have in the other person, and in the quiet, another fracture forms within themselves. They begin to notice that their boundaries have shifted far beyond what they once considered acceptable. They have said, "It's okay," to what was not okay. They have offered understanding to what should have been met with accountability. And as much as they wish to keep believing, the repetition of the wound begins to carve deep grooves into their own soul. It is not a single incident that breaks them, but the accumulation of countless small moments where they swallowed their truth for the sake of peace. There comes a day when the empath hears their own voice differently. It is quieter, not because it is weaker, but because it is tired of echoing the same forgiveness into an unchanging space. They realize that their love has been mistaken for permission, that their understanding has been used as a shield against consequences. The breaking point does not always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives with a calm so absolute it feels like a shift in the earth. The words, "I forgive you," do not come not because the heart is closed, but because the heart finally understands that to keep forgiving in the same way is to participate in its own wounding. It is in this moment that something irreversible happens. The empath no longer rushes to patch the tear in the connection. They no longer rearrange their boundaries to accommodate another's disregard. They stop stepping in to absorb the shock of truth for the sake of maintaining a fragile illusion. The silence that follows is not an absence, but a presence, an unspoken acknowledgement that the relationship can no longer continue in the same way. It is a stillness charged with truth, one that cannot be undone once it has been felt. The empath has not stopped caring, they have simply stopped carrying what was never theirs to bear. This end of unlimited forgiveness is not a conscious decision made in the heat of a single moment, but the result of a long, unseen process. It is the culmination of countless inner negotiations, the slow awakening to the cost of their own generosity. The realization that love without boundaries is not love at all, but self-erasure. It is the point where self-respect outweighs the fear of losing the connection, and where the need for truth eclipses the desire for harmony at any cost. Forgiveness is often spoken of as a virtue, a noble act that elevates both the one who grants it and the one who receives it. But there is a hidden danger in forgiveness when it is offered repeatedly in the absence of any real change. It becomes less of a bridge toward healing and more of a revolving door through which harm is allowed to re-enter again and again. For the empath, whose natural instinct is to see the best in people, this danger hides in plain sight. They believe that by forgiving, they are creating the conditions for transformation, that their willingness to release resentment will inspire the other person to meet them with sincerity and growth. In the early stages, this faith can feel justified. People do make mistakes, they falter, they act out of fear or ignorance, and forgiveness can indeed be the light that guides them back. But over time, patterns reveal themselves. The same apologies are repeated, the same promises made and broken, the same wounds reopened as if no lesson had been learned. The empath begins to notice that the forgiveness they offer is not being used as an opportunity for reflection, but as a shield against accountability. It becomes a kind of unspoken contract. No matter what happens, the empath will smooth over the jagged edges, will put the pieces back together, will hold the connection intact even if they are the only one doing the work to keep it alive. In this way, forgiveness without change ceases to be a gift of love and becomes a subtle form of self-betrayal. The danger lies in the way it erodes the boundaries of the one who offers it. Each time they say, "It's okay," to what is not okay, they teach the other person that their pain has no lasting consequence. The weight of the hurt is silently absorbed, hidden from view, while the cycle resets itself for another round. This is not the fault of forgiveness itself, but of its misuse. Forgiveness was never meant to be a tool for avoiding discomfort or preserving illusions. It is meant to be the closing of a wound after the bleeding has stopped, not the continual covering of an injury that is still being inflicted. For the empath, realizing this truth is often painful. It requires confronting the possibility that the person they are forgiving has no real intention of changing, that the harm is not a product of misunderstanding but of a deeper unwillingness to evolve. This realization can shake the very foundation of the empath's worldview, for it forces them to admit that love and understanding, no matter how pure, cannot force transformation on someone who resists it. The soul that forgives endlessly without evidence of growth begins to carry the weight of unchanging reality, and that weight becomes unbearable. It is here that the empath begins to see that forgiveness, when given without the counterpart of transformation, becomes a form of permission. It signals that the same harm can be repeated without consequence, that the relationship will continue to function even in the presence of betrayal, dishonesty, or neglect. This is the slow poisoning of trust, a process so gradual that it can go unnoticed for years. Yet once seen, it cannot be unseen. The empath begins to recognize the hollow echo in the apologies they hear, the practiced tone of contrition, the absence of tangible action to make amends. In the end, the lesson is stark. Forgiveness is powerful, but its power lies in its connection to genuine change. Without that, it becomes a quiet act of self-sacrifice that drains the one who offers it while empowering the one who takes it for granted. The empath, in their longing to heal, must face the truth that sometimes the most loving choice is to stop forgiving in order to allow the other person to meet the weight of their own actions and the reality of what they have created. Clarity has a way of cutting through illusions more sharply than anger ever could. When forgiveness is withheld, not out of spite but out of recognition that it has been squandered, the veil begins to lift from every carefully constructed facade. The empath, who once softened their gaze to protect the other from exposure, now looks with eyes unclouded by hope that is no longer rooted in reality. This clarity is not loud. It does not arrive with dramatic accusations or heated arguments. It arrives quietly, like the first light of dawn, revealing the true shape of the landscape after a long night. And once seen, the truth cannot be unseen. The moment forgiveness is withdrawn, it is as though a mirror is placed directly in front of the one who has been wearing the mask. Without the cushion of automatic pardon, the weight of their choices rests fully upon them. The rehearsed apologies lose their charm. The carefully curated image begins to fray, and the subtle manipulations that once went unnoticed stand out in sharp relief. Clarity strips away the comfort of ambiguity. It forces every hidden motive and every concealed truth into the open, not because the empath speaks them aloud, but because their silence refuses to participate in the dance of denial any longer. Masks, by their nature, require an audience willing to believe in them. They are upheld by the collective agreement to pretend they are real. When the empath stops forgiving, they are, in essence, withdrawing their part of that agreement. They are no longer willing to smile politely while lies pass as truth, or to interpret harmful actions in the most charitable possible light. This withdrawal of participation is what causes the mask to falter. Without the empath's understanding to absorb the contradictions, the inconsistencies begin to show. Without their patience to smooth over the rough edges, the truth begins to poke through like jagged glass beneath a thin layer of paint. This clarity is not always welcomed. To those who have relied on masks, the empath's new gaze can feel like a threat. It is unsettling to be seen without the filters that once kept flaws hidden, to feel the weight of one's own shadow without the buffer of someone else's forgiveness. Some may respond with defensiveness, others with denial, and still others with anger. But no matter the reaction, the mask has been compromised. Even if they attempt to repair it, the crack remains, and the empath will always see it for what it is. For the empath, this is a turning point. They come to understand that forgiveness had been functioning as a kind of protective covering, not only for the other person's dignity, but also for the fragile illusion that the relationship was healthier than it truly was. Removing that covering is an act of liberation. Even if it feels uncomfortable at first, it allows both sides to stand in the light of what is, rather than what one wishes it to be. In this light, truths that were long obscured take on a stark clarity. Patterns become visible, motives are easier to read, and the shape of the dynamic is no longer distorted by the constant bending of perception in the name of compassion. It is in this unfiltered reality that the empath begins to reclaim their own vision. No longer clouded by the need to maintain harmony at all costs, they can see with precision. They can discern between genuine remorse and practiced performance, between growth and the mere appearance of change. Clarity becomes the tool by which the empath not only recognizes the masks others wear, but also the ways in which they themselves may have participated in keeping those masks in place. And from this recognition, a new kind of strength is born, one that does not rely on illusion, but on the courage to face the truth exactly as it is. There is a profound inner shift that occurs when the empath steps away from their familiar role as the perpetual healer and moves into the position of the seer. For much of their life, they have been defined by their ability to soothe, to mend, to take the raw wounds of others into their own hands and treat them as if they were their own to heal. This role feels natural because it aligns with their deep sense of compassion and their intuitive understanding of emotional pain. They see the suffering beneath the anger, the fear behind the cruelty, the longing hidden within the coldness. Their instinct is to respond with tenderness, with patience, with the kind of forgiveness that believes transformation is always possible if given enough time and love. But there comes a moment when this role no longer fits, not because their compassion has run dry, but because they have learned through experience that healing cannot happen without willingness from the other side. When repeated attempts to mend are met with the same patterns of harm, the empath's role begins to feel less like healing and more like enabling. This realization is not born of cynicism but of wisdom, a recognition that their constant interventions may actually be keeping the other person from facing the consequences that could lead to real change. It is here that the transformation begins. The seer does not abandon compassion, but they wield it differently. They understand that true healing is not the act of removing all discomfort from someone's path, but of allowing them to meet their own shadow without interference. The seer watches without rushing to fix, speaks without diluting the truth, and holds boundaries with the same tenderness they once reserved for forgiveness. Where the healer took on the burden of the other's pain, the seer hands it back, knowing it is not theirs to carry. This is not detachment in the cold sense of the word, but a deeper connection to reality, one that honors the autonomy and responsibility of every individual. In this transformation, the empath learns the power of precision. They no longer give endlessly in all directions, but choose carefully where to invest their energy. They can distinguish between those who are sincerely trying to grow and those who are only seeking shelter from accountability. Their empathy becomes sharper, more discerning. Instead of cushioning the truth so it can be swallowed easily, they present it plainly, trusting that the right people will recognize it as an invitation to rise rather than a condemnation. This shift often surprises those who have known the empath only as the healer. The sudden clarity, the refusal to overextend, the quiet withdrawal of constant forgiveness. These changes can feel like a loss of warmth to those who were accustomed to unconditional accommodation. But the seer is not cold. They are simply no longer willing to sacrifice themselves on the altar of someone else's comfort. They have learned that love without truth is not love at all, and that boundaries are not walls but the necessary framework in which real connection can exist. As the empath steps fully into the role of the seer, they begin to see patterns in human behavior that were once obscured by their desire to believe the best. They notice the subtle manipulations, the repeated excuses, the cycles that continue because no one is willing to interrupt them. And they realize that their new role is not to shield others from the light of their own truth, but to hold that light steady, even if it reveals shadows that make others uncomfortable. In this way, they transform from someone who absorbs the wounds of the world into someone who reveals them, and in revealing opens the door for authentic transformation to take place. When forgiveness is no longer offered automatically, the dynamic between people changes in a way that is impossible to ignore. Without the familiar cushion of immediate pardon, the one who has caused harm is left to confront the full weight of their actions. There is no longer a gentle hand smoothing over the tension, no quick reassurance that everything will be fine, no soft reframing of the event to make it more palatable. Instead, there is space, uncomfortable, silent space, in which they must sit with what they have done and consider its true impact. This space can feel cold to those accustomed to being protected from such moments, but it is in this coldness that the heat of accountability begins to burn. Truth has its own kind of gravity. Once it is allowed to exist without being diluted, it pulls everything toward its center. Excuses, half-truths, and justifications begin to collapse under their own weight when they are not met with immediate forgiveness to hold them together. The person who once relied on the empath's endless understanding finds themselves without a shield, exposed to the reality of their choices. They are forced to look at what they have done not through the softened lens of someone else's compassion, but through the unfiltered clarity of consequence. For the empath, this shift is not about punishment. It is about honoring the truth over the preservation of a fragile peace. They begin to see that comfort built on denial is no comfort at all, and that sparing someone from the discomfort of facing their actions is ultimately a disservice. This does not mean they abandon kindness, but their kindness changes form. It becomes a quiet, steady presence that refuses to participate in the deception of pretending nothing is wrong. Their silence in the face of wrongdoing is not agreement, it is an unspoken insistence that the truth be acknowledged. In this way, withholding forgiveness becomes an act of integrity. It communicates that actions have meaning, that words carry weight, and that relationships cannot survive on a steady diet of unaddressed harm. The absence of forgiveness where it has not been earned is a mirror, one that reflects back not just the wrongdoing, but also the patterns that have allowed it to continue. For those willing to truly see, it can be the beginning of transformation. For those unwilling, it can mark the slow unraveling of a bond that was held together more by illusion than by truth. This refusal to prioritize comfort over truth often requires the empath to confront their own fears. They must resist the urge to step back into the role of peacemaker when tensions rise, even though every instinct in them is to soothe. They must trust that allowing discomfort is not cruelty, but necessity. They learn that the moments of greatest unease are often the ones where growth begins, if only the other person is willing to endure them. This is a difficult discipline, for it means standing in the presence of another's anger, defensiveness, or sadness without rushing to absorb it. In time, the empath comes to understand that truth has its own form of compassion, one that is not soft or indulgent, but steadfast and liberating. It frees both people from the weight of pretense, creating the possibility of a connection that is grounded in reality rather than maintained by avoidance. And though the process may strip away the layers of comfort that once masked deeper issues, what remains is something far stronger, a bond, if it survives, that is built not on the avoidance of pain but on the willingness to face it fully. When someone has built their sense of self upon masks, those masks exist only because the surrounding environment allows them to remain intact. They are sustained by a network of subtle agreements, people choosing to overlook certain inconsistencies, accepting explanations without question, or pretending not to notice what lies just beneath the surface. The empath, with their tendency to forgive and their willingness to see the good in others, often becomes a central figure in holding these masks in place. By smoothing over contradictions and explaining away questionable behavior, they become a silent collaborator in the maintenance of the facade. But when that forgiveness is withdrawn, the balance shifts dramatically. The mask loses one of its most crucial supports. The absence of automatic pardon is not just a removal of grace, it is the removal of camouflage. Without the empath to reinterpret actions in the best possible light, flaws that were once hidden stand out clearly. Small manipulations that used to pass unnoticed now ring with a sharper tone. Deflections and justifications no longer land softly, they hang in the air heavier than before, because there is no one rushing to reinterpret them. This is when the mask begins to slip, revealing fragments of the shadow it was designed to conceal. For those who have worn their mask for a long time, this exposure can feel destabilizing. Their carefully constructed identity depends on others believing in its authenticity, and when that belief wavers, cracks appear. The empath's refusal to continue upholding the illusion forces a confrontation with the reality beneath it. Sometimes the wearer scrambles to repair the mask, layering on more charm, more denial, more elaborate narratives in an effort to restore the old dynamic. Other times, the mask shatters completely, revealing a self that has been hidden not only from others but from the wearer themselves. This unveiling is not always met with gratitude. In fact, it is often met with hostility. Being seen for who one truly is, especially when that self is not aligned with the image presented, can feel like a threat to survival. The empath may face accusations, blame, or attempts to turn the exposure back on them. Yet, even in the midst of this resistance, the truth remains visible. Once the mask has begun to fall, it can never be worn as convincingly as before. The eyes of the one who has stopped forgiving are no longer clouded by the desire to protect or excuse, and this clarity alone is enough to keep the mask from ever fitting quite the same way again. For the empath, witnessing this process is both painful and liberating. Painful because they must accept that the person they once defended was not entirely as they seemed. Liberating because they no longer have to carry the burden of protecting an image that was never real. This is where they begin to understand that their forgiveness, though rooted in kindness, had been serving a role that went far beyond compassion. It had been functioning as a shield for deception. By stepping back, they allow reality to emerge, however uncomfortable it may be. The fall of the mask is in many ways a reckoning. It is the moment when authenticity and illusion are forced into direct contact, when the story someone tells about themselves collides with the truth of their actions. Not everyone will choose to face this moment honestly. Some will retreat further into pretense, while others may finally begin the work of self-examination. But either way, the dynamic has shifted permanently. The empath is no longer a silent accomplice in the preservation of falsehood, and without that cooperation, every mask begins to lose its hold. There is a quiet misconception that compassion always means extending another chance. That love is proven by how much pain one can endure without walking away. Yet there comes a time when the truest form of care is found not in another act of forgiveness, but in the firm decision to no longer shield someone from the consequences of their own behavior. The empath, who has spent so much of their life absorbing the harm meant for others, begins to realize that doing so may not be helping anyone at all. In fact, it may be allowing destructive patterns to continue unchecked. When harm hides under the language of love, it becomes difficult to confront. Words of affection and declarations of care can serve as a disguise for neglect, manipulation, or betrayal. The empath, eager to preserve connection, has often been willing to believe that such harm is unintentional or that it will be corrected in time. But when the patterns repeat, it becomes clear that the damage is real regardless of the intention behind it. To keep forgiving without requiring change is to participate in the illusion that love and harm can coexist without cost. Refusing to offer forgiveness in these circumstances is not a withdrawal of love, but a redefinition of it. It is saying love does not mean I will allow you to hurt me or yourself without consequence. It is an acknowledgement that boundaries are as essential to healthy relationships as affection. Without them, love becomes distorted into something that tolerates harm in the name of loyalty. The empath learns that by refusing to participate in that distortion, they are not abandoning love, they are protecting its integrity. This decision often comes with discomfort. The empath may fear being perceived as cold or unforgiving, and they may struggle with the guilt of not stepping in to ease the other person's pain. Yet over time, they begin to understand that enabling someone to avoid responsibility is not kindness. True kindness lies in creating the conditions where genuine growth can occur, and growth rarely happens without the friction of facing hard truths. When the empath steps back, they allow that friction to exist. For the one on the receiving end, this change can be jarring. They may be accustomed to the empath absorbing the impact of their actions, smoothing over conflicts, and preserving the illusion of harmony. Without that protection, the reality of their behavior becomes impossible to ignore. This can lead to anger, blame, or attempts to manipulate the empath back into their old role. But for the empath, the decision has already been made, not from spite, but from a deep commitment to both self-respect and authentic connection. Over time, this refusal to forgive without change reshapes the relationship. In some cases, it may collapse entirely, revealing that the bond was sustained more by the empath's tolerance than by mutual care. In other cases, it may become the catalyst for transformation, as the absence of unconditional pardon forces the other person to confront their own patterns. Either outcome serves the truth. The empath is no longer investing their energy into maintaining a connection at the expense of their own well-being. In learning to withhold forgiveness when it would only protect harmful patterns, the empath discovers a new dimension of compassion, one that is not about carrying another's burden, but about allowing them to carry it themselves. This shift honors both people. It respects the empath's need for safety and dignity, and it respects the other's capacity to face their own shadow. And in doing so, it redefines love not as endless endurance, but as the courage to say that love and harm cannot occupy the same space without something being lost. Illusions are fragile things. They can survive for years when everyone involved agrees, consciously or unconsciously, to protect them. They are maintained through repetition, through selective attention, through the small compromises people make with themselves in order to avoid facing something uncomfortable. But they are powerless in the presence of unyielding truth. When the empath stops forgiving in the way they once did, they withdraw the constant flow of understanding that once acted as the glue holding those illusions together. Without that steady reinforcement, the cracks in the facade begin to widen until they can no longer be ignored. The truth, when it stands alone without being softened or reinterpreted, has a way of revealing itself in sharp, unmistakable outlines. Every contradiction, every excuse, every performance that once seemed convincing begins to look different under this light. The mask of sincerity slips when there is no one left to interpret actions generously. The patterns of harm, once blurred by repeated pardon, stand out in stark relief. It becomes clear what is real and what is only a projection designed to maintain control or preserve an image. For the empath, this moment of seeing is both liberating and sobering. They understand that their forgiveness had been functioning as a form of protection, not only for the other person's reputation or self-image, but for their own hope that the connection could remain intact. By withdrawing it, they are not punishing anyone. They are simply allowing reality to exist without interference. This act, though quiet, can feel like an earthquake to the one who has depended on the illusion. The stability they believed in is revealed to have been built on borrowed patience and unspoken concessions. The collapse of an illusion can be disorienting. For the one who wore the mask, it strips away the safety of being misunderstood in a favorable way. For the empath, it dismantles the narrative that their endurance was bringing about meaningful change. Both are left with the raw material of what actually exists between them, and it is in this unfiltered space that the future of the relationship is determined. Without illusions, there is no longer the possibility of continuing in the same pattern. Either the truth is acknowledged and addressed, or the bond begins to dissolve. What makes illusions so persistent is that they often serve a mutual purpose. The one causing harm can avoid accountability, and the one forgiving can avoid the pain of confrontation or loss. But this mutual arrangement is not sustainable when one side decides that truth matters more than comfort. When the empath reaches this point, they no longer reinterpret hurtful actions as mistakes or miscommunications. They see them for what they are, and in seeing clearly, they stop enabling the continuation of the harm. This is where transformation becomes possible. Truth may cause temporary discomfort, but it also creates the conditions for genuine healing. Without the distortion of illusion, growth can take root in real soil. Yet not everyone will choose this path. Some will cling to the mask, resisting the clarity that has been forced upon them. Others will walk away entirely rather than face what has been revealed. But whether or not change occurs, the illusion is gone, and it cannot be rebuilt in the same way. For the empath, living without illusions means living with a deeper sense of alignment. They no longer expend energy holding together a reality that does not match their inner knowing. They no longer protect what is false at the expense of what is true. This may mean losing certain connections, but it also means that the connections that remain are rooted in something solid. In the absence of illusion, what endures is real, and what falls away was never truly theirs to hold. When the empath stops forgiving without limit, it is not the end of their compassion, but the beginning of their self-respect. In that moment, illusions collapse, truth emerges, and what remains is a love that no longer erases itself to survive.